roughly for the last month, Russia started to assemble troops in the northern, across the northern border of Ukraine. Belgorod is the particularly hotspot. We had roughly a corps deployed there. The entire grouping of forces in the north is over 50,000 men strong, roughly 4,000 main battle tanks, a bit over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, and 1,200 pieces of artillery. That is a shockingly large force compared to most European armies. It is more armored vehicles, more main battle tanks than the Bundeswehr, more armored vehicles than the Italian army has. It is more artillery pieces than the biggest three European countries have combined. But actually, for the size of the war in Ukraine, it's not that much. Especially in terms of manpower. A lot of units assembled there are very much understaffed. And of course, this corps is stretched out across a wide perimeter. So in Sumy Oblast, there are actually much fewer people and more artillery pieces than manpower. Belgorod, they assembled roughly a corps-sized assault group or operative maneuver group. Now, what is, of course, notable is that there's a quite high percentage of special operation forces amongst these groupings, and these special operation forces have been busy over the past month to reconnoiter the area, to abduct people, both civilian and military, from troops guarding the northern border, to conduct small raids into the gray zone, into Ukrainian-controlled territory. And that has also kept Ukrainians busy, but that also is a part of the preparatory phase of this offensive. So the Russians very well know the defensive lines and very well know the terrain and territory, because they have been probing this for months. Also, these elite forces have infiltrated beforehand, before you saw the mechanized assault, to make life more difficult for the defending forces. This is a tactic well known on the Russian side. They used it in Avdiivka, they used it in other places, to use small infantry detachments to infiltrate Ukrainian lines, to clandestinely occupy important terrain points, and from there to distract, deceive, or pin down the defenders when they start to react to the mechanized assault, and also to guide artillery fire and glide bombs. Now, what makes it, of course, more difficult on this large stretch of northern border compared to the normal front is that, of course, the Ukrainian force density is much thinner there, because Ukraine needs most soldiers in the east. So, of course, these special forces have more vulnerable points where they can actually infiltrate through, because the borderline is not so densely manned. Russia started to prepare this offensive in sort of the week before it started. So roughly from May 4th onward, we saw a dramatic increase of drone activities, or especially around the Belgorod Oblast, we saw an increase of the Russian Air Force flying in, dropping glide bombs. We pretty much knew what was going on, and everybody knew what was about. Actually, in the report of the Ukrainian General Staff, in the evening before the launch of the offensive, there was a hint that Russia is preparing to launch this offensive, and there is the immediate threat of it coming. So there was, of course, no surprise on the Ukrainian side. We can definitely exclude that. Nevertheless, of course, the Russian forces managed to breach. First, they invaded, of course, into the border area, and that's not a very difficult thing. We should not imagine the border, the direct border, as something where you have a sort of guarding man and massive amount of trenches and dugouts right at the border. Russian shelling, artillery activity, Russian drone activity has basically made that a pointless endeavor. Ukrainians would just have spent a lot of resources just trying to man the border. So we have a very lightly manned screening line behind the border, and those are just screening troops that guard minefields and that man observation posts, but it's not a defensive line. And the real defensive line then starts much further back, 7, 15, sometimes even more kilometers behind the border. Why is that so? Well, first and foremost, because Ukraine used civilian contractors to build these fortification lines. You need caterpillars, you need basically, usually you do that with an engineering corps, but Ukraine has fewer engineering capabilities. These civilians, you can't send them directly to the front, whether you have or to a kind of frontline situation where you have immediate drone threats, where you have immediate shelling, because civilian caterpillars are not armored engineering vehicles, etc. The second thing is it would impede these works all the time. So better to have a screening line before that kind of keeps the Russian busy and construct your deep defenses further back. And the other thing is, of course, Ukrainians intended to lay a lot of mines beforehand, just like the Russians did. Unfortunately, Ukrainians don't have that many mines, so Ukrainian minefields are not as especially at the current state, not as deep as the Russians were in the south. But basically the idea was, of course, the same. And we saw some minefields that really held up Russian troops. Unfortunately, only partially. Russia managed also to breach the Ukrainian defensive lines, the proper defensive lines, at least in the area of Ovchank, where they're now behind that. That led yesterday to the dismissal of the commander of the Ukrainian operative group North. And it's certainly an indication that things were not going according to plan on the Ukrainian side, and there were mistakes made. But it's not completely surprising. Ukrainian troops manning the northern border are second-line troops. The really first line, the elite troops, are in the east, where you need them. The other thing is, of course, they lack a lot of heavy equipment. They have much fewer pieces of 155 millimeter artillery. They usually rely on 120 millimeter mortars, which is fine artillery, and Ukraine produces the ammunition for these systems themselves, so they're much more independent from international aid on that. But of course, the range of these mortars is much shorter, and crews are not so used to constant firepower. There's equipment side of this. There's also training and experience side. These territorial defense troops haven't seen so much combat so far, and they haven't seen such intensive combat so far. So that the skill level, of course, is different, and that is a problem Ukrainians know. Syrsky tries to address this since he basically got into command. He appointed new people for revising training schemes and revising officers' training, but all these things also take time. You can't retrain officers when you have a fighting war going on in a couple of months. That doesn't happen. Now, what's the big objective of this offensive? It's not to take Kharkiv, the city. The forces are much too few for that. They don't have the strength to nurture the offensive if they breach further. Their main purpose is to distract Ukrainian reserves. And that happened. Ukraine now, it seems to have stopped the Russian advance, but of course by redirecting army-level reserve troops towards the front. Very experienced mechanized forces that have a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of tanks, a lot of infantry fighting vehicles, a lot of heavy artillery. And they are, of course, used to the fight with the Russians, and they stopped them and they induced quite heavy losses, and that's what happened. The problem is, of course, that these forces are also needed elsewhere. If you just look at the reports of the Ukrainian General Staff on Unquiet, they report 50, 60 combat engagements or major Russian attacks. On the heydays of the Russian winter offensive, they report 90 and slightly over 90 Russian attacks. This was when sort of the winter offensive was on its culmination point. Now, yesterday we had 150 recorded major combat engagement and Russian attacks. So, of course, these are only indicative numbers. We don't have sort of clear picture how big these attacks were, etc. But it's a good indication on the combat activities on the front line. The front line is extremely busy and extremely violent as the day. So we can actually fairly certainly say that the Russian summer offensive everybody has expected has now started. And this Kharkiv offensive was a flank offensive or a diversion to facilitate that summer offensive. Because if you also look into the progress Russian forces, for example, around Ocheratyny. They are for the past days, they progressively make roughly 1 to 1.5 kilometers a day westwards and northwards, and that's bad for the Ukrainians. That's the real center of gravity of the Russian assault. Also, Kharkiv Yar is extensively contested, and the Russians are attacking the flanks of the city. They try to surround it. They stopped assaulting it directly, but you see extremely violent battles there. We have a very critical situation north of Vuhledar and also Siversk. Russians are making considerable progress, and in Kupiansk, Russian forces have entered the outskirts of Kupiansk, not Kupiansk, the city proper, but the villages adjacent to it. So we can see Russian progress across the fronts, and all that progress should be contained by army-level reserves on the Ukrainian side. Now that their artillery ammunition situation is getting better, they would have the firepower to do so. But of course, the Russians trying to open another front, trying to diverse, they try to spread out the Ukrainian forces as much as they can to roll Ukrainians back in the Donbass. That is, of course, a very tricky and bad situation for Ukrainians. Basically, what they can do is try to limit the losses, their own losses, try to withdraw from exposed territories as much as they can, try to keep the Russian losses in the process high, to improve their situation once the Russian offensive has culminated and they have treated the Russians to a sufficient point. These are difficult days now. On the other hand, we see that in the main fighting sectors, Ukraine had to give territory, but there is no breach on the front. The cohesion of the Ukrainian defensive line always maintained. That is, of course, a testimony to the force quality of these troops, especially fighting in the Donbass. It's by far not easy to fight under the circumstances Ukrainians are fighting in. Especially from the West, I would refrain from comments on the situation there regarding force quality. I would not bet that any European army would do better than Ukrainians under these difficult circumstances. Now, some other points I want to address. There's been a lot of discussions on the Western role in this kind of offensive and why it was, at least in the initial attempt, successful on the Russian side. So was the delay of American artillery ammunition a major reason? I would say not quite. First of all, because most of the territorial defense forces entrenched on the northern border don't have the artillery pieces to fire the 155 millimeter artillery pieces. They're either Soviet 152 millimeter artillery ammunition there is supplied by Europe, and they have 120 millimeter mortars. Also, the artillery ammunition situation got better once the American aid kicked in. Just on a sidekick, I don't want to hear any strategic autonomy talk until Europe delivers 2 million rounds of artillery pieces and 500 air defense interceptors a year into Ukraine. Before that happens, I don't want to hear that topic ever again. But back to Ukraine, of course, the issue of the disparity of force quality is something Ukrainians know. Remember the discussion about the next round of mobilization. A lot of critics of the mobilization said, well, isn't the Ukrainian army inefficient, being roughly 700, 800,000 men strong as an armed force, but only deploying roughly 300,000 men to the war in Donbass? Can't you, instead of mobilize, rotate forces from the northern border, from rear area duties into the front and out? Yes, on a spreadsheet that is feasible. But in reality, this is difficult because there are these force quality disparities. You see that in the offensive now. Just imagine what would have happened if you would have pulled these light infantry forces out and sent them into Kharkiv Yar or Avdiivka. They lack the armored transport to transport troops and ammunition into and out to positions under heavy artillery fire. They lack the infantry fighting vehicles to organize a mechanized delaying action. They lack the main battle tanks to provide direct fire support. They lack the heavy artillery to really cut off the battlefield from further Russian reinforcements. They lack the electronic warfare assets to suppress Russian drone activities. They also lack the training on how, even if you would give them all these assets, they lack the training how to properly use them. They lack to experience how to do that. You just can't put an infantry fighting vehicle on the backyard and say, now use it. This needs training. This needs experience on the vehicle, how to operate with it, etc. And there's a training side to it. There's an equipment side to it. Now, the West, here I would rather put the blame on the West. The West actually knows about the Ukrainian deficiencies in terms of armor transport. It does very little about it. The French do, the Danish, etc. They do something about the artillery. There are good initiatives ongoing. Here the situation will improve. Ukrainians also produce self-propelled artillery pieces on a quite impressive number per month as of now. But in terms of mechanizing Ukrainian forces, we are still far behind in terms of providing armored transport. And I'm not losing words about infantry fighting vehicles, who are much more wanted and needed and sought after than even armored transport, but we're lacking armored transport to start with. And there's also the training issue, and that takes time. Yes, Europeans and the Americans could support Ukraine more by sending military advisors, by helping Ukraine retrain mobilized officers, train more officers and staff, work on planning. Where tactical leadership is sort of taking a tree line, defending a tree line. Usually Ukrainians have ample of experience in doing that, and they know how to do that under their conditions. But if we go into brigade core leadership, like leading the operative group now, this is more about logistics, about planning, etc. Even if you have a lot of tactical experience in fighting, these are kind of different things that Ukraine just had too few officers who were really experienced with that, because before the war, the Ukrainian armed forces was a much smaller army. If you mobilize and increase size very quickly, you have a hard time catching up, training all the specialists that are needed to make such a large force operable. So the Russian goal will be to keep up the pressure on Ukrainian reserves. I don't think they will try to nurture the offensive they have now, but rather look for different spots on the front where they can penetrate the first Ukrainian line. Look for some weak spots where there are few defensive positions. Via their probing exercise, have determined that the territorial defense forces in that particular sector are slower or weaker than in other sectors. They might push there, just because the main objective is to spread out Ukrainian forces. Now, on the Ukrainian side, they will try to push back the Russians behind the first proper Ukrainian defensive line, but they've breached them, and otherwise just contain the Russians where they are. If they take some border villages, that is, of course, politically bad. But militarily, it's not a tragedy for Ukrainians, because the main defensive lines are further to the rear. The problematic situations occur if they approach or breach the main defensive line, because the second and third line, they're not really established. It's basically one big line that is properly prepared for defense. That is a problem. That's a problem of limited engineering capacity on the Ukrainian side. They, of course, know that more lines would be better, but you can only build one, and it's if you take the border to Belarus as well, it's 2,000 kilometers that you need to fortify, and that takes time and effort and resources. Once sort of Russian incursions are contained, Ukrainians will move their reserves more to the Donbass, because that's still the hot phase of the offensive is going on, where the bulk of the Russian forces are committed, where the heaviest fighting is taking place, and where also Ukrainians have the chance to induce the maximum losses on the Russian assaulting formations. And that's, again, we are in a long war. Ukraine will be on the defensive for 2024. It will most likely be on the defensive in 2025 as well. Ukraine is fighting to attrit the Russians, that after this time they have the chance to conduct an offensive again. They also need time to cure all their issues in training, education, force quality disparity, etc. They will need all of 2024 to do that. They will probably need 2025 to do that as well. They need time to research and develop new solutions for problems that they have with Russian reconnaissance drones and loitering munitions. That takes time. So don't be impatient with that. This is a long war. Now, again, the target for Ukrainians is not to hold kilometer X or Z, but to induce the maximum amount of losses on the Russian side, in order to later on free up or open spaces for pushbacks. And on that, if you just look at the numbers of destroyed vehicles and indicative losses, Russian losses are considerable. There are a lot of good OSINT guys who count Russian depots and their storage sites. They are depleting them at a alarmingly high pace. If this continues the way it does, Russia will get urgent problems in resupplying its troops by the end of next year.